So today, we're in the city of Senlis, about 27 miles north of the city of Paris, a city located along the Nanette River. The ancient city on this site was the city of Augusto Magus. This is a combined Gallic and Latin name. Augusto comes from Augustus, the emperor who was in charge when the city was founded, and Magus meaning field of, so the field of Augustus. Now, we don't know of any Celtic settlements that particularly occupied this site, but we do know that Senlis is situated at an important crossroads where both the main north-south road that stretched from Lyon to the ocean and the main east-west road that went from Riam to Rouen both intersected. And so what this means is that Senlis is a particularly important place of commerce and cultural exchange. And so this is why the amphitheater in particular is so interesting. Now, Senlis itself in antiquity was not a particularly large city, but the amphitheater behind me seated perhaps as many as 10,000 people. So how did you get 10,000 people in a space like this in a town that is nowhere near this size? Well, the answer seems to be that the location of Senlis at this important crossroads meant that lots of people from the countryside could come into Senlis to watch festivals, to watch gladiatorial games, to watch venaciones, and to generally partake in the civic life of the town. It also meant that high-quality entertainment and high-quality performers would come through this area as they were making a circuit across the various parts that those roads traversed. And so we have here a first-century amphitheater. The amphitheater is about 1/2 the size of the Colosseum, so it's a relatively small amphitheater. The arena floor itself is actually literally half the size of the Colosseum. The amphitheater also is perhaps half the size and extent of the Colosseum. But there's some very interesting features about the amphitheater in Senlis that are worth noting. First of all, what we have here is the arrangement that is typical to other Roman amphitheaters, with a main axis, a major axis that stretches from the east to the west, and then a minor axis that goes from the north and south. Now, the east-west axis led people into the amphitheater. And so along the east axis, what we see are people would walk from ground level into the amphitheater. The amphitheater was excavated from surrounding hills, and then brickwork and construction was used to hold in place the earthwork that undergirded the seating structures. When people walked from that ground level into the bowl of the amphitheater, we can see now that there were columns that represented a kind of monumental gateway. And so people would walk in through the gates of the living. When they came into the amphitheater, they would walk past 2 carceres that contained cells in which gladiators and animals would be held before they would come onto the amphitheater floor. Then they would climb up to their seats using steps. Now, if we turn our attention to the minor axes, what we see are 2 very distinctive ways that these functioned. Now, to the south side, we see it lead onto the main podium, and the podium probably that would have represented the equivalent of the imperial box in Senlis. Underneath that is something that's quite interesting. It's a shrine, and in there we see niches in which were once placed statues of gods, and remains of a statue of Hercules were found when that particular site was excavated. On the other side of the arena, to the north, there is another axis that enters in, but this one is slightly different because it enters onto the podium, but alongside of the place where this enters are 2 walls that separated out the elements of the podium that one could reach by entering in that axis from the rest of the seating area. It's understood that this probably represented a space where actors or musical performers would perform for audiences in the amphitheater. And so this is in some ways functionally similar to what we see in Lutetia, where you have an amphitheater that also doubles as a theater. But in Senlis, the amphitheater is fully surrounding the arena floor and the stage. And so this is a very unique modification of that structure. There are a couple of other aspects of the Senlis amphitheater that are also really worth noting. The arena wall was actually constructed not high enough to prevent performers and animals from jumping up to the podium and attacking the most prominent guests in that particular part of the seating area. And so what the fathers of Senlis had to do was create a set of structures that prevented those animals from getting up to the place where they could potentially harm viewers. So they created a set of corniches, and then above this they put a balustrade. And in the balustrade, we still see drilled remains of places where some grills were placed to overhang over the edge of the arena floor to prevent animals and objects from coming up into the stands. Now, another aspect that's particularly interesting about the Senlis Amphitheater is in the 3rd century, this amphitheater was walled off to become something of a fort. So to the north side, when one looks at the vomitoria and the main entry on that minor axis to the north side, one sees the remains of a 3rd century Roman wall with the opus mixtum technique inside of it. And so what this suggests is the Senlis Amphitheater was fortified in the 3rd century at roughly the same time the rest of the town was fortified. Now, the amphitheater seems to have fallen out of use at that point. The last time we see any indication of people being in this space is through 5th century numismatic evidence. And after the 5th century, this spot became overgrown and largely forgotten, but not entirely forgotten. We have documents from the later Middle Ages that talk about this area of Senlis as the Ren. It's not clear that people understood that there was an amphitheater here, but it's suspected that this was probably the case, though some people did imagine that this name for this region actually was connected to the number of frogs that were in this particular location. Now, the amphitheater itself was discovered in 1865, and it was something of a chance excavation that led almost immediately into an excavation that centered on the imperial box and the arena wall. And so very quickly, the excavators in Senlis understood what they had found and understood that they'd found a very significant Roman amphitheater. The excavations continued for about 20 years until in 1885, the space was fully excavated. Now, the afterlife of the theater and the amphitheater has been particularly interesting as well, because in the middle of the 20th century, this was used as a space for spectacles. There was actually bullfights and other spectacles that took place in the space of the amphitheater. But the space right now is maintained by a civic organization in the town of Senlis. And because of this, the amphitheater is incredibly well preserved and incredibly well taken care of. So what we see here is a very unique example of later Roman architecture or later imperial Roman architecture from the 1st century that is very uniquely structured but has an incredibly diverse and interesting life and afterlife.